Welcome to CTO Think, a podcast about leadership, product development, and tech decisions between two recovering chief technology officers. Here are your hosts, Don Vandemark and Randy Burgess.
Hey, Randy. How's everything going well this week?
Everything's going great. We're going to skip talking about ourselves, and we have a guest.
Yes. So today we've got Jess Szmajda with us today. Welcome, Jess.
Hey, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Sure. So Jess is the CTO at Axios, and we invited her on because in our previous episode we had been talking about the evolution of the CTO role and how it differs as companies grow and all that, and I had stumbled across a post by Jess on her blog talking about how she fits a lot of those different roles. So we thought it would be great to have her on and talk about some of that. So Jess, could you give us just an introduction of yourself, a little bit about what you do and how you got to where you are?
Yeah, happy to. Well, let's see. I've been in tech since I was a kid. Got a computer early on, that's about it. So taught myself BASIC and all those kind of stuff. Had an IT support company in my neighborhood when I was a teenager in like the mid 90s, and ended up doing sysadmin stuff. I was a Solaris admin for a number of years in the late 90s. Did DevOps before there was DevOps with terrible Perl scripts and everything like that. So that was a lot of fun. Ended up doing some web consulting, built a bunch of terrible PHP sites, joined a consulting group. I think the highlight of the consulting group was that we built a wireless ISP from scratch. So I did all that engineering. That was really pretty exciting up in the Berkshires in Massachusetts. And eventually joined a men's magazines and sports supplements company where I built all their technology and then the team around it, and grew that team to about 8. And then met somebody who had this idea for a way to help retailers deal with their returns more effectively. There was a ton of returns in the marketplace, and basically a lot of retailers were just throwing them away. And so in 2010, we founded Optoro, and grew that from just a handful of people to about 250, which is where they are now before I left. And then about 4 or 5 months ago, I had somebody reach out to me and talk to me about what Axios was doing, which was really interesting. I shockingly had not heard of Axios before I joined, but I was really excited to learn about how Axios is really trying to cut through the noise in the news business. I mean, there's a whole ton of... It's actually, just to back up for a second, it was founded by some of the same people who founded Politico. And what they noticed is that Politico, only about 25% of the people would get past the first paragraph, and only maybe 5% of the people would get to the end. And
wow.
Yeah, right, exactly. So news is kind of broken. So they decided to create Axios to focus on what matters in a way that's worthy of your time, and built that starting about 2 years ago. And so they really got a lot of really great influential people reading very quickly. I think most of the Hill reads us. I think a whole bunch of leaders in industries all over the place read us, which is a great honor for us. But some of those leaders came to us and they're like, wow, you communicate so effectively. Can you help us communicate that effectively? And so we did some consulting. We identified a product opportunity to help people communicate more effectively. And that's when they realized they really needed to become more of a tech and product company. And that's when they started looking for people like me. So I joined about 3 months ago. Coming into what's really a digital media company in its structure, but is really hungry, I think, to be a product company and a tech company. And so I joined, Chief Product Officer joined about a week after I did. We're now building the team pretty quickly, and so it's a really exciting place to be.
Well, excellent. And it's so the blog post that you had put out there, it was just simply titled the CTO role. And what we had been talking about when Randy and I were talking last episode, we were talking about how it changes as a company grows from being the person who can explain the technology to a potential co-founder or founder, to maybe being the first developer, to then having to grow into how do you scale all this up, get your DevOps in place, to having to manage people, and that whole progression that it takes. And your blog post here was very much about how you've been able to do a lot of that through your career, and how you feel you can fit each of those things. So why don't you talk a little bit about the blog post and what was covered in it?
Yeah, sure. So I wrote that post when I was considering, do I want a VP of engineering here at Axios? And I was thinking a lot about this and really trying to think hard about it, because I'd never had a VP of engineering before, through a variety of reasons. It never made sense. It was never something we searched for. But I was presented with the question a number of times, and I really was thinking hard. And so I did a lot of reading about what other people talked about, the difference between a CTO and a VP of Eng, and how those roles pair together or don't. And fundamentally just realized that my perspective on, at least through the sizes of companies that I've been with, and there's a lot to be said about companies that scales beyond where I've personally seen, but in the sizes of companies that I've been with, like, that kind of bifurcation doesn't seem to have made sense for me. What's made sense for me is, certainly to step away from a lot of the day-to-day, but to have, functional area leads that are really great in their domains. And so maybe to some extent, some people might call them like VPs of engineering, but I've called them chapter leadership. Typically they've been directors and senior directors. Occasionally somebody has had a VP title, but it's not been a VP of engineering, I think, especially as the industry thinks about it. I'm a very deeply technical person. I'm also very, very focused on people. I think that is pretty rare among technical leadership. Mm-hmm. I do like to lean into that combination of strengths. I think that it helps me create an organization that's more effective. But I recognize that that's my approach. I certainly don't think this should be everyone's approach.
Right.
Well, so what you're kind of talking about, you mentioned the one comment of your background that struck with me the most was, I have a history of horrible PHP sites. And I definitely have that in my background. And so, but as I've talked to lots of CTOs hiring VP of engineering, and they may be talking to me about the role or something else, I've found that you're different in that you have the technical background. You've built things from scratch. You learned at the technical level versus you learned at the management executive level. And so the VP of engineering title is really where people, unlike yourself, need someone to fill in the blanks because they don't have always that technical expertise. And that's generalizing, I know, but that's what I've often found, is that a lot of CTOs hiring VP of engineering folks, or that have them, don't have that background that you have.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I saw that in what most people were writing in various posts. Like, it was either this, a CTO is a business person or a manager who needs to have somebody come in and help make sure the technology is working well, or it was the other way around, where the CTO was like the deeply technical visionary and then couldn't bring the people management to the table. And I do think bridging that divide, and in technical leadership at large, I think I've seen that's a pretty rare thing, to both have technical depth and that kind of emotional intelligence and people skills to be able to bring everything together. And I mean, it's great when I find that's what I look for in my technical leaders, but I think it is rare.
Yeah. I think there's also an element of title creep that as big companies get bigger, kind of like a bank, you can go to a local bank office and everyone's a VP. You start to need, you need to keep people happy, and title elevation is part of it. And you start to see senior and lead team devs and all that kind of stuff creep up too. You can only have one VP of engineering in most cases, but that hasn't stopped banks from doing that kind of thing too.
Yeah, and this is the thing I thought again about, like, title creep in their industry is ridiculous, isn't it?
Yeah.
And whether you can only have one VP of Eng or not, actually, is another thing I've been toying with. Like, I think that as an industry, we think about the VP of engineering. And we think about it as being a singular thing. But what if we had multiple VPs of engineering, and VP was simply an advancement step in a ranking sort of system? Yeah. I think that actually could make sense. And I think that most of what I was writing about was this idea of a singular VP as like owning some major domain. Like, I just feel like that would be unnatural for me and friction for me,
Yeah. Well,
yeah,
go ahead.
For
John,
sure.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. What I was going to say is it kind of mirrors what the progression my career took is I worked my way from developer to project manager to essentially account executive and then to CTO. So it was that mixture of technical to projects to business, and then the overall oversight of people. But I've also seen along that progression that doesn't work for everyone. There are plenty of really good developers who need to stay in development, need to be bringing their technical expertise because their project management skills or their people management skills aren't as strong. And I think it's just a career choice that everybody's got to make and feel out what works for them. And it sounds like it's worked out well for you that you've been able to do pretty much all of it.
Yeah. I think this is actually an area in which I have struggled with, is to understand that not everybody does this, because you're totally right. But like the way I've structured some organizational things in the past that I think where I've met friction have been in assuming that a leader in a certain engineering function can be both technical and great at people. And I think that's an area that, like, for example, I used to say at one point in my life that I don't understand the role of the architect, and I think architects are dumb.
Well, I agree with you. But I worked at IBM, so I completely have that.
Yeah. So I think, though, I've come around to this idea of there's a need for a deeply technical leadership in a way of, like, I have a vision and I want to bring that vision into reality kind of a leadership. And I want to get people on board with that vision, as opposed to like the management structure. And so I think that there's, room in organizations, and as I look forward into the organizational structures, for these kinds of technical leaders that aren't managers. And I think that then that lets me start to think about how to bifurcate that structure as it fits the people and the organization and all those kinds of things. But for myself, I like to think about it all together.
Right.
Well, the comment about architects, which I don't consider myself an architect ever, because I'm always like, at the end of the day, I'm also a general contractor and a contractor. I'm also coding. We get the term architect usually from like construction. That's where we kind of first think about it. At least I do. And in that world, there's a great divide between the people implementing the design, the people that are coming up with it. And the architecture is, in a way, a sales process too for a lot of people in that business. But in our world, there's a really narrow line between what is an architect and a person that turns around and actually works on the code and does the build. And so that's why I think it just doesn't make as much sense in our industry. I know there are people that hang on to that title like it's something they will never give up, like being knighted by the queen. But it doesn't. And I've just never been at a company big enough where someone could just be an architect and that's all they did was just sit there and think about what everyone should be doing versus being like hands-on in it. And that's just, again, a product of being in small companies, I think, on my side.
Yeah. I worked with some, really major retailers at my last organization, and, top names you would easily recognize, and certainly worked with an architecture group at one point to do an assessment of our technology to see how it would fit into what they have going on there. It was an interesting perspective into how that function was working at a large organization. It seemed like there was just such a vast array of different systems and capabilities that they had built over the years, and a lot of legacy too, that just fitting the pieces together and understanding the kind of interfaces between them and how they would impact each other was a full-time role. And in fact, actually, it sounded like there was a whole group of like 3 to 5 people who was just doing this. So, and then they came to us and they wanted to understand like our, system characteristics, performance things. I mean, it was a cloud-based product, so more about how like the APIs were going to integrate, the kinds of, SLAs we were going to provide, or security and things like that. But they went pretty deep in a lot of really interesting ways. And it seemed to be right at that level of organization. Yeah. But That's a big organization.
So how big is the Axios technology team? You may have already mentioned
Oh,
this.
sure.
I forgot to.
No, it's fine. So Axios right now is about 160 folks, and of that, about 23 makes up product and tech. And we're still doing budget numbers for the year, but I might double it this year. So we'll see. It really depends on the market traction we get on the new products and how that goes forward. But we have very big dreams. We really hope our new products could be as ubiquitous as Slack. So we'll see how we go.
So then I guess when you, not talking about the numbers of people, not talking about your budget numbers, but when you think about, hey, we may double the team over the course of the next year, do you still in your mind see it as like a very flat team where titles aren't a significance? Because we talked about the CTO role, and your blog post was obviously talking about that split with the next person down. But where do you envision titles being somewhat necessary just to have a hierarchy of who sets priorities, perhaps? Like, what do you see if you're going to double that size? What do you kind of see happening with titles in that aspect?
Yeah. So just to clarify one thing, I don't believe in flat organizations. I don't think that actually makes sense, and that's not what we have today, and it's not how I would go forward. And for context, at Optoro, at my last place, I had a team of about 90. So I've scaled this up to a decent size. The way I think about it is, I guess let me back up a step and say how we're kind of operating model is we're structured in the cross-functional squad or pod model. Some people call it the Spotify model. Where we have these, I like to call them autonomous collectives, where there's like a product manager, some number of engineers, a quality engineer, a designer, and they own products or aspects of a product from soup to nuts. And they, inside of a squad, it's a small team of 5 to 10 people. I think it's really important not to have a manager in that squad. I think it's really important to try to make that organizational unit as flat as possible because it helps promote things like psychological safety. It helps promote better outcomes for the team. It helps everybody think about what is their, strengths that they can bring to the table and make the entire product successful. And we hold the squad together as a unit accountable for delivering on a great product or aspect of a product as it may be. So for example, a squad here owns Axios.com. Another squad owns, we're looking at maybe shipping an app. So we're doing that kind of thing. Another squad owns some of these new communication products. So outside of the squad model, it's really important to have leadership and management. Yeah. It's really important to have people who understand what it is to be a great Python coder or a great React developer and help people understand that and hold them accountable to doing great things at that. And so we have what we call chapters, again, pulling from the Spotify terminology. And so a chapter is like a front-end development chapter or a back-end development chapter. Chapters have leadership. Typically, it's like a director or something, although it might be a VP at some point. And they are responsible for defining what it is to be a great, you name it, a great front-end developer or whatever. Hold people accountable to doing a great job. Do that kind of management, the performance evaluation, the advancements in growth, hiring, all those kinds of things. That happens in the chapter. And it's the big differentiation, I think, in this model is that the selection of what to do and handing out work and slicing it apart isn't done by that leader as much as it's done by the squad itself and determining where to go. And so the chapter leadership determines how to do the job great, and the squad determines what to do.
Interesting. So real quick, I want to talk about the naming of these teams, and you briefly mentioned it as you were talking about chapters, but this is the first time I've heard the terms chapters and squads used in this context. Where did that come from? As far as where you, is that something you've seen in the past? Is it something you came up with?
Yeah, no, we pulled the terminology from some of the writing that Spotify did about their engineering culture. Heinrich Nieberg wrote a lot about this, years ago. So in their model, there's 4 organizing concepts. They call it the tribe, the squad, the chapter, and the guild. We've decided to change the tribe word to house. But like a house for us is a collection of squads that operates in a given product domain. So for Spotify, for example, they have a house that's all about the desktop player. And then they have different squads for like the playlist component or the playback ability or things like that, where they can have aspects of the products in a team that can really own it and make it great. But together, the house owns a holistic product. And so that's more of like a product organizational structure. Then the chapter organizational structure is defining like leadership in how we think of traditional like engineering management, like performance evaluation, growth of staff, effective outcomes, good technology in general comes to that. And then the guild as an organizing component is more about here, I think, as a way to have internal learning and development. So, for example, there may be a guild around machine learning or a guild around Vue. Or this is more of an informal thing which Spotify uses to structure their corporate retreats to give people an opportunity to, have like an internal conference or something. I think it's a really interesting concept. We haven't really gone too deep on it here or at Optoro in my past where I used the same model, but the chapter, house, and squad concept is definitely something that I've used again at Optoro and here at Axios.
Interesting. It's like I said, it's brand new to me. I had not heard of these terms, so I want to dig into that afterwards, and we'll put some links to some of this stuff in the show notes.
So,
yeah, I can't recommend it enough. It's really awesome.
I'm curious. Sure. This is kind of a long-winded question, so bear with me. But
sure.
I'm a consumer. I'm an end user of Axios, and the other day I just noticed Axios came up because Game of Thrones was showing the world, hey, we have all this other stuff. Before we end the show, Axios came up as, I guess, you all are reaching out and doing television, moving into television. So in the, I'm not trying to ask you about strategy. I'm more curious about if a company hasn't done television before, do you create a new house, guild, pod? Do you create a new vein of your team that is completely experienced with that new arm? Or how do you approach something brand new to what the organization has done before?
That's a really interesting question. So Axios and HBO is doing it. We're about to launch our second season really soon. I'm very, very excited. June 3rd is going to be the first show. It's been awesome to see it happen. The film crew comes through our offices here and actually uses our office on camera. So I might be in B-roll somewhere in the background. We'll see. That's really, really cool. A very exciting thing for me. The way I think about entering a new business line is, I think it's important to do some early product exploration to understand if there's a potential for traction. And so to do that, you can either use internal staff who has some ideas around it, but I might hire a consultant to help us just learn about that and see if we can connect the dots in here and there. For the HBO show, we're working with a production company who deeply understands this, and they're a fantastic resource, and they've really, done a lot of that for us, help us connect the dots. But from a product perspective, especially when we're doing new product development, we go through this whole product discovery process where, we try to do prototypes and ideation to see what our products are, how they can fit the market, iterate on that testing until we find market fit, and then invest deeply in it. And so once we've understood that we have an idea that could fit the market, then that investing certainly happens. And then we look at okay, does our team have the capabilities today to do that? Could they learn those capabilities? What's the cost of that versus acquiring people from external who would have those, or working with partners? And that's, I think always a business conversation that's really interesting to have and to look at all the various components of the decision. But fundamentally, you have to think about it not just as a not invented here thing, or I'm going to pull this off the shelf. It's a combination of factors that I think gets into it. So, but I think the most fundamental thing is to have a product person who really understands the space, and to have an engineer who really understands the technology there. And if you can have those two as core seeds, I think, to really get into something, I think you can build a lot around those people.
This is an anecdote, which that is just kind of a sidebar, I guess. This American Life tried this with Showtime maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and they basically they did exactly the opposite of what you're doing, what you're talking about. And they admitted they pulled the plug on it, and Showtime was like, well, no, we still want to do this. And they were like, we can't handle this. We can't work the way we normally do. going down this new path. So that's when I remember reading their podcast, their blog post about it, and then what you're talking about now. That's exactly what they should have done, because TV is just a different beast.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting. The differentiation between like a digital media company or a media company and a product company, I think it's just that. It's how do you address the market? How do you launch products? Like, who are you? How do you think about the world? And if you think about the world as like, we want to take our editorial perspective to the world, that's one thing, and that's great. And I think a lot of great media companies do that. But I think what Axios is trying to do is think about, well, what is the market looking for? What do people actually want? And how do we, deliver to them products that they actually want? And I think that's what defines a product company.
If you had time to work on code again, what would you choose?
Yeah. Let's see. So I do a fair amount of just like random scripting stuff to poke at things. So I certainly almost always have a terminal open somewhere. I have not. I may have submitted one PR so far to the team in the 3 months I've been here. I typically do about a pull request a quarter. It's usually just something here and there I'm scratching an itch. I want to make sure that I stay fresh in technology. I think it's important to really understand that. Outside of work, though, I do like to code as much as I can make time. So I've got a number of projects on like GitHub that I have or have not contributed to. I would love to do. So there's this thing called the Recurse Center, which is this thing up in New York. They used to be called Hacker School, I guess, but it's like an engineer's sabbatical. You can go.
I know.
You know about it?
Someone I worked with took part in that for maybe 6 months. It was a good chunk of time. So I know someone that did it.
Yeah, you could do from like a week to a year, I think even. But I know that if I ever went to Recurse, there's this project I've been languishing on, but it's a Ruby VM written in Haskell, and I would really love to get back to that. So I got it to like parse and to actually do like immediate execution of Ruby code through like puts. But I need to go re-engineer the internals and switch it to be an actual VM with like probably LLVM instructions. And I would love to spend some time poking at that.
I feel like my friend that went to it, and he's very private, so I'm not going to say his name, but I feel like Ruby and Haskell was exactly what he was going after when he went there. It was very much about, I don't know what the end value to anyone but myself is to do this and learn this, but he held it very close to this as something he wanted to try to work on. So, and that's what he gathered from it. I mean, I can't remember all the feedback he had about the experience, but I feel like he came out saying, I needed to do this. It was worthwhile for him.
Yeah, it's really cool. I think it's really important to have like crazy experiments to some extent. I also think it's really important to try to actually make things. And so I typically have like a side project here and there. I've got this one that I was doing with like Elm with a Rails backend, and that was just an interesting way to combine some actually feasible technology I think you might find in the real world. And then I also just love to think about how computing and programming works, and that's why I love Haskell so much, frankly, is because it gives me an opportunity to kind of get my brain to think a bit differently. I actually give this advice to mid-level engineers often that you should. This is 7 Languages in 7 Weeks book. I think that's really interesting, but fundamentally, it's about like getting your brain to think about the task of programming from a lot of different paradigms. I think that just helps you a ton, and I think it just helps me stay fresh. I think about this other thing called oblique strategies. I don't know if you've heard of this, but it's basically a theory that like if you are thinking about a problem, if you instead think about a problem that's in a unrelated domain that has some similar structure, it'll actually help tease apart the problem that you're actually working on. And so like there's a whole deck of cards you can get around this, but I think it's just an interesting way of like getting your mind working through problems is to solve other problems that aren't exactly the same problem.
So now I guess I have another question, mainly because I haven't been in your shoes with a team as anywhere near as big as 90, even 20. Now, and this happens to many people that move up the ladder from hands-on role to management. How do you personally deal with the lack of hands-on attention? Maybe this is more of a memory from the previous role. When you're not hands-on anymore, perfection is no longer something that's even feasible from your vantage point. How did you get through that transition to being more of a hands-off people person to, what would actually make stuff work and what good code is?
Yeah. Yeah. So it's an interesting assumption you were just kind of walking through, is that perfection is something that we want. I don't think I want perfection. I want pragmatism. I want to ship something that's reasonably good enough that, if a user complains about it, I can fix it fast. But I want to get things into the market and get things in people's hands and learn and iterate as quickly as possible. So then, to step back to your original question, I think about what I do as, using systems to solve problems for people. And I used to do that very directly as a programmer. I would, create systems of code that a computer would execute to solve people's problems. And the way I really helped myself work through that, because I definitely felt, I'm not coding anymore. What's going on? Is this good? I worked through that. And the way I came to it was, I'm still creating systems that solve people's problems. I'm just doing it in a more abstract way. I've kind of stepped up the ladder of abstraction a bit. And now I create systems of people and of procedures and processes and of guidelines and boundaries and tools and techniques that solves people's problems. And I do it in a much bigger way.
Well, very cool. So Jess, thank you again for joining us. Okay, great. Randy, anything to add?
I still have a question that we could probably put in front of your
go
closing.
for it.
And I know you have to take off. I know you have to take off, Jess.
Yeah,
but,
go ahead.
I'm not trying to hold you around. I'm curious about how much hands-on tech you do now, just as maybe it's a time thing.
So Jess, in reading your Twitter profile, you've got the various hashtags in there, and some of that is identifying gender. So you've identified as trans, and you've identified your gender as a she, and that's one of the things that we need to be talking about in tech generally, is diversity among genders, diversity among race. So wanted to see how you've been in DC with Axios, you've been in DC with Turo, which is at least from an outsider's view, is usually a very diverse area. So how has technology treated you throughout your career so far?
Yeah, no, that's great. I do put those hashtags on my profile because I do like to talk about it, and I'm
Sure.
very happy to chat. And I think that, as a sidebar, most trans people really don't want to talk about the fact that they're trans, and I feel that because I'm so comfortable, I should talk even more about it. So, because so few people get to ask these kind of questions, and I think that they're really important to get the perspective. So I transitioned in 2017 while at Turo as the CTO there. And the company was great. Not a single person really gave me any kind of friction, and I had no trouble at all. And I know that a lot of my friends in the trans community did not have that same kind of experience, especially outside of DC or San Francisco. And it's kind of a bubble, and I'm really lucky to have been able to go through those awkward years really here in a safe place.
Sure.
But it's a big challenge for sure. And so I think this is why representation matters so much, is so that people can understand that, being trans, going through that kind of a transition, is just a thing that somebody needs to do for themselves. It has no bearing on their how they work. Well, I mean, frankly, it's probably going to make them a better worker because they can put to bed a lot of worries, and things like that.
Sure.
And it's true. Like I've been a ton more effective since I've come out. But it brings up a lot of interesting questions. Like, women in tech is a big, there's a big lack of women in tech right now. And so the more I can help women, get to the kind of places that I've gotten to is a huge passion of mine. I'm very fortunate that Axios has been willing to sponsor DC Femtech, which is an organization here that helps women code and just kind of move through technology, and a number of other kinds of diverse-oriented organizations. I think sponsorship is super important, and I would frankly challenge all of the CTOs or other listeners that you have to think about ways that they can sponsor more diverse people getting into technology, because I think a lot of it comes down to access, and it comes down to expectations that people have growing up. Being raised when people saw me as a guy, being into tech was not a weird thing. And I did not get the kind of friction that I know a lot of people who are raised as women got about their interests. And there's a lot of like, oh, this isn't for girls, or this isn't for you. I mean, like, that was a big element of privilege that I had. Absolutely. It enabled me to pursue my passion and to get to where I've gotten to. Just the way that people are treated in the workforce. I mean, like, I say to people, like, tongue in cheek, but true, like, I knew that I was being accepted for myself as a woman when people started to talk over me in meetings. Like,
that's horrible, but yeah, I get it.
Right. Yeah, but it's real. So it's like there's so many things that still happen in our society that come across this gendered line, and I've had the immense privilege to see it very directly. But it just says even more to me that I think it's so important that we think about the things that we do either thoughtfully or unthoughtfully that make a difference. And so I would recommend at the most, like, or at the least, sponsoring people, finding people to reach out to, mentoring, spending your time. It helps a ton.
Sure. And in my own clumsy way, that what I've first off, I have a associate that I've worked with at a previous job who's transitioned as well. And she works at Red Hat. And that culture there seems to be fairly inclusive, and fairly accepting of that. And, that's there in North Carolina. So that's a nice pocket of inclusiveness in an area that may not be known for that. But one way I've tried to broaden at least my exposure to the things that the lines of thought we need to be doing is I'm trying to follow a more diverse list on my Twitter feeds. I'm trying to make sure that it's not 80% male anymore. And I'm very intentional about, if I add a male person, I take time to go seek out a non-male in as well. I take the time to do that, because I feel I need to see the various perspectives of that. So I don't know that that's enough, but I'm trying to improve the way I think and the way that I see the world.
Well, I feel like we've tacked on a really important subject to the tail end of a different episode in a way. So I would rather. It's almost like we should have you on again to talk about this one subject. But I guess I'll ask a question related to. I used to live in Chicago. There's a very large LGBTQ community. And so I never really felt like there was a gap as much in the community there as I live in a smaller city now, Kansas City. And I am like, I have no idea where these communities are here. So I guess my question is more from your perspective, Jess, if there is a manager who has they are isolated and they are or maybe ignorant about LGBTQ community, what would you recommend that someone that is like, I don't know where to get started, I don't have any contacts, or I don't have a network, where would you suggest someone in that role that is most likely a cis white male, where would they get started to kind of break down the walls they've already got up?
Yeah, that's I've never been asked that question. There's a lot of websites that are trying to do outreach. So there's GLAAD or the HRC or the NCTE is the National Center for Transgender Equality. There's a bunch of advocacy organizations that do those kinds of things. what is it? PFLAG, the parents and families. Oh, geez, I forget how to de-acronyme.
Yeah,
yeah.
We'll look it up.
Yeah. So those are good, I think, kind of overall umbrella places to start. Certainly online is there's a ton of people. If you just like search for like hashtag trans or hashtag, there's one that we use a lot called Girls Like Us. And so hashtag Girls Like Us, and you'll see a whole bunch of random trans stuff. So you can look on Twitter, you can look on other communities of interest. I think that's really interesting. And I think you'll start to find that those communities are tightly integrated, and it'd be really interesting to look at the graphs around these kinds of things. I think those are fantastic places to start. I think, frankly, I am very, very happy to talk to anybody. So if you get stuck, please reach out to me on Twitter or wherever else, and I'll try to find somebody to connect you with and who wants to chat. I think a lot of the times it's just about, listening to somebody and learning about their experience. When I transitioned, I had some of my ex's family was, very upset and reactionary to it. And sitting down and having a conversation, I think I was able to help them understand how this wasn't something that I was choosing to do to their family member so much as it was just something I needed to do for myself. And I think those are really difficult and important conversations to have, to understand people's perspectives and their paths, and how this is not a choice, and it's a thing that is simply a part of who some of us are. And as much as like the color of people's skin may be more obvious, who we are inside, I think, is less obvious but equally unchangeable. And I think it's really important to get that perspective.
Yeah, and I mean, I feel like the resistance to this, like you said, that particular part of the family, is always about resistance to change, number one, and fear of things you just don't know. And at least that's the perspective I've seen with everyone that either discriminates or just has opinions that are very walled in. And somehow just simply meeting people and talking to them, getting part of that network is by far the strongest method to get started in understanding how other people, the perspectives and the way people feel about things. So
I think so. And I think it's really interesting how, as technologists, we are so accustomed to change. Yeah. Like, change is constant. It's everywhere. And I think that leaves us a little bit more open to thinking, okay, well, change in individuals is to be expected too. I don't think everybody gets that perspective, especially outside of tech. So I'm very happy to talk.
That's a very interesting stance. That statement that the fact that we're in tech leaves us a little bit more open to change is something I hadn't thought about, but that's very interesting.
Yeah.
So, well, thank you again, Jess. Appreciate you coming on and spending time with us and sharing all this with our listeners.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.
Wish me luck on a title for this episode that covers everything we talked about.
And I'd be happy to talk more about diversity and stuff at another point.
Awesome. We would definitely like to have you on again to talk about this.
Great.
Where can people find you on the various social networks, Twitter, that sort of thing?
Yeah, sure. I'm probably most active on Twitter. My handle is Jess Szmajda, very easily spelled. So that's
definitely in the show notes.
yeah, it's show notes or JSZMAJDA. If you search Szmajda on LinkedIn, if you can spell it, I'm certainly there. Happy to chat. And my blog is loki.ws, and I've got a discuss thing on there. If you'd like to have a conversation about the post, I'm more than happy to engage with you.
Well, great. All right. Well, thanks again, and have a great
Thanks,
day.
You too. Take care.
Thanks for listening to the CTO Think podcast. Show notes and previous episodes can be found on our website at ctothink.com. Reviews on Apple iTunes are always appreciated and help promote the show. Patreon contributions help us to produce episode transcripts, which allow people that are deaf or hard of hearing to access the show. If you have feedback, ideas, or want to be a guest, please email us at hello@ctothink.com. Show music is Dumpster Dive by Mark Wallach, licensed by PremiumBeat.com. Voiceover work by MeganVoices.com. You'll hear from us next week.